What's up, everyone? True Techno Gamer here, coming at you from a different location altogether. Here I am in my hotel at GDC Game Developers Conference 2024, and it's Tuesday as of this recording. And you know, there's some interesting things going on that I needed to talk to you guys about. I wanted to try to get this video out this week because I don't know when I'm going to have time. I'm going to be here for pretty much all week, and then just work and stuff. I don't know when I would really been able to record this. So people have already been kind of asking me. Of course, some of you guys may know the PS5 Pro specs have apparently leaked. It's pretty much all out there, and the information that has leaked has been confirmed for the most part. So I'm not going to go into all of the specs. That's not really what I want to do here. The specs are out there. I'll link them, you know, to various places so you can see them for yourself. I want to talk about really what the implications are of the specs, and also, you know, talk about some of the feedback that has been going around about the specs and explain why the specs kind of look the way they do, why we're kind of in a position, Sony's in a position that they're in, and as gamers, why we're in a position that we are in. So I'm not going to go all into, like I said, the details of the specs, but I will touch on a couple of things. So first and foremost, the specs that have leaked are not quite yet official. They're not. Apparently the leak came from a Sony developer portal. So in that regard, I guess, you know, there's some validity to them, but Sony has not announced this thing yet. They have not announced the PS5 Pro. They haven't said anything about it officially. So just keep that in mind, because I really do suspect that there may be some differences when we see the final specs, even if it's just some of the smaller details. But there's a lot of stuff going out around there, and I'm going to distill it like this. And I've said this already in various forums. But really, there's only really three key takeaways to take away from the specs. Before getting caught up in all the details that people are extrapolating and calculating, you know, this and that and teraflops from this number and that, like what they have laid out, there are three concrete things that we can conclude, okay? The first is that Sony has indeed developed, this has been rumored for a while, there have been patents online and stuff like that, but Sony is indeed releasing a form of machine learning upscaling. They call it PSSR. And basically, it's something akin to what DLSS is, if you guys are familiar with that. The idea here is, you know, Nvidia has DLSS, but the problem is that Nvidia DLSS is only limited to Nvidia hardware, Nvidia GPUs. So AMD comes along and releases FSR, which is their, you know, super resolution. So PSSR stands for PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, I believe. And then FSR we have, and then Intel has their own super resolution upscaler as well. A lot of companies at this point have their own in-house ones. One of the most famous ones is probably Insomniac's. They have their own in-house, upscaler. They call it temporal injection. Their temporal injection solution. So all of these things are meant to do the same thing. The idea behind PSSR, why it's kind of cool, is it is actually machine learning, which is similar to DLSS. So the quality, in theory, should be a lot better than FSR from AMD. FSR from AMD is what is most commonly used on consoles at this point because it's open. So it can be used on anything. Again, NVIDIA's DLSS is not open. So FSR is everywhere pretty much, but the quality, especially at lower resolutions, can be really bad at times, to be honest. And frankly, FSR has ruined the image quality of a number of console games in particular. Dead Space Remake comes to mind for me, but there's a lot of games out there. Forspoken had weird issues. Final Fantasy 16 has some weird issues. Hogwarts has some issues. Alan Wake 2 looks a mess. I mean, there's a number of them where you look at it and it's like, you know, and a lot of that is FSR. So a machine learning, AI-driven upscaling solution will put Sony, especially on the console front. I mean, Xbox doesn't have anything quite like this yet. So that'll put Sony in the driver's seat, so to speak, and in theory can be a great tool for PlayStation 5 developers and PlayStation 5 Pro developers to be able to get higher resolutions, higher image quality, and higher frame rates. So that's a cool thing. Now, there's a lot we don't know about what that thing is. You know, they mentioned some bits and pieces here and there, but we know that they're making it. They mentioned that it doesn't have to be trained. The actual like AI doesn't have to be trained per game, which is important for adoption. So they're going to have some pre-trained models that games can adopt, which is cool. So we know that. We know that for PS5 Pro, it should be targeting at least 4K 60. Point number 2 that we know is that the GPU is going to be a much bigger GPU. It's going to have a lot more CUs. It's not quite twice the size like it was in the PS4 Pro. It's not quite twice as many, shader units and that kind of thing, but it is a sizable increase, roughly 70%. And we know that it's not going to be RDNA 2, right? RDNA 2 is the architecture that's used for the current PS5, right? So it's not going to be that. We don't know if it's going to be RDNA 3, RDNA 3.5, RDNA 4, or some hybrid of all of the above. We don't know exactly what that looks like, but we know it's not RDNA 2 for several reasons. One, the number that they mentioned in the document pointed to a teraflop rating that was 67, and that FP16. I'm not, again, this can get really, really in the weeds, guys, really, really technical. I want to kind of, again, as I try to do, keep it relatively accessible to even the layman people here for the most part. But needless to say, that number, and you can calculate that down into what that can look like for an RDNA 3 GPU that we already know that are out on the market, it kind of matches up very, very well with RDNA 3 GPUs, especially ones that are configured with the number of shader units that the PS5 Pro should have. It does not necessarily match up to RDNA 2 for that. So, in other words, they're using something called dual issue in the shaders, which means that they can process, kind of double the amount of instructions, so they get double the amount of throughput, essentially. That's something that's unique to RDNA 3, and it's not present in RDNA 2. So the fact that they're even, that is what the numbers kind of point to, we know it's not RDNA 2. So that means RDNA 3 has some more efficient cores, and it has some increases to the ray tracing performance, which is point number 3. So point number 3 is that Sony is leaning heavily into increasing the ray tracing performance. The numbers that they put out there in the leaked documents is saying ray tracing performance increases over the base PS5 by anywhere from 2 to 4x, which is significant. That doesn't mean the frame rate, the overall final frame rate increases by 4x. It means that the ray tracing performance, at least some level of the ray tracing pipeline, is increased by, up to 4x, 2 to 4x. That's still sizable increases. So what that means is more games having ray tracing that don't have it on a base PS5, or even games that have it on a base PS5, but maybe lacking some features compared to the PC. Now you can add those features back in, or you can just maintain the PS5 ray tracing mode, but now do so theoretically with higher performance, right? So get higher frame rates or higher resolutions while having ray tracing enabled. So all 3 of those things are on the table. So that's all good. So those are the 3 things. I'm not getting caught up in all of the deductions and calculations and additional rumors spreading around clock speeds and what the performance really will look like. And, we don't fully know. And I don't want to go into just pure speculation mode on a lot of that stuff yet. What GPU and the PC does this really look like, and what kind of what the frame rates are going to be. Like, we can't really deduce a lot of that stuff quite yet, okay, to be honest, right? Again, none of this stuff has technically been confirmed by Sony, but it does seem to be generally valid. But again, I caution that not only are these things not confirmed by Sony, they could change. They're subject to change. It's March. This thing is not supposed to come out till November. Even, most things are going to be set by now, but things like the final clock speeds and stuff like that, we don't know. And it's also possible there have been word going around that Sony had been expecting PS5 Pro docs to leak weirder things have happened, guys. I mean, that we haven't seen documents that have been up somewhere that have either just been really outdated or in some cases just misleading intentionally or not. So again, I'm just saying, just wait for the final word to really start drawing the full conclusions. But those three things are safe bets. Now, a lot of the talk, right, has been with some of the additional details that has come out. And the biggest one is probably the CPU. Short story, the CPU is mostly unchanged at all. Not even really much of a clock speed increase, right? So the PS5 Pro CPU is still Zen 2, it's still 8 cores, and the frequency is still basic at default 3.5 gigahertz. Everything about it is exactly the same. PS4 Pro saw a 30% frequency increase. So that's something. But we're not seeing that here. There's a boost mode apparently that where the CPU can boost 10% plus 10% clock speed to get it to 3.85, but that's not even free. When it boosts, it implies that it's taking some performance away from the GPU, 1%, not much, but it's interesting that they can't even get a 10% boost without taking away and downclocking the GPU. So there's a lot to uncover there about, the overall takeaway. The other thing, and I'm just going to lay it out here before I get into it, but the other thing here is the GPU performance. So there's a lot of kind of weirdness in terms of what the numbers are putting out. Sony's put out. People are calculating teraflops. The teraflop rating that we can deduce from the data that's come out. Again, this is an official number that's necessarily been said by Sony, but it's kind of a calculated deduced number. Is 33.5 teraflops. Again, that's RDNA 3. RDNA 3 fundamentally with dual issue calculates teraflops differently. Short story. If you want to get an apples to apples teraflop comparison to the PS5, which is 10.23, whatever it is, 10.23, 10.27, whatever. If you want to get a apples to apples comparison to that 10 teraflop machine, essentially you got to take that 33.5 and divide it by 2. And when you do that, you get something around 16.7 teraflops. So even with that said, that looks like not quite a 2x, so all the rumors, and I alluded to this, all the rumors, the targets initially were 2x rasterization performance, non-ray tracing, and then 2.5x with ray tracing. Those were the original targets that had been rumored for, well over a year now. So this doesn't look like it hit that, right? It looks like at best 10 teraflops up to 16.7. We're looking at something around, 65%. Plus 65%. Now that's not small, right? But it's not quite 2x, obviously. And it's not as nearly as big as we saw on the PS4 Pro relative to the PS4. Keep that in mind. So the documents mentioned that Sony said essentially that you can expect rendering performance, is how they worded it, to be about 45% faster. Now, that number is fairly small, right? Rendering performance, or the GPU performance overall in the PS4 Pro was over 2x, right? It was over 2x with the clock speed and such. And then, we saw what the result of that was. So now we're not even seeing 2x. So taking a GPU-bound game and doubling resolution, so it's running at 1440p, can we just double it to 4K? No, not on the Pro, not with these numbers. That's actually a relatively small bump on the surface of it, right? So a lot of talk and a lot of feedback, and people are disappointed about the fact that the CPU hasn't moved, which implies that frame rates, in CPU-bound cases at least, frame rates aren't going to increase by that much, or if at all. And, that the GPU performance raster-wise, again, we don't see that brute force power, at least to be able to get us to like doubling resolution or doubling, frame rate and that kind of stuff. So what does that leave us with? Okay. Now I'm going to point out something here. If nothing else, the takeaway here is this is a really, really clear and stark reality check in terms of what the real practical world looks like in terms of building hardware, computer hardware today. It is indicative of the fact that we have been hitting the limits, the limits of physics in terms of being able to scale up hardware. We've been seeing this now developing for years. The fact of the matter here, guys, and I'm going to say this very clearly, very slowly, because you got to understand what this is like in terms of building these things from companies like Sony or Microsoft or whatever. We are living in a time when the cost per transistor, okay? So historically, the cost per transistor would go down over time, right? And you can, and the size of the transistor would also go down pretty dramatically, right, over time. That was essentially the concept of Moore's law, right? Moore's law indicated that, you know, every 18 months or so, right, essentially we can double computing performance. The reason why we can do that is because the transistor size would shrink by roughly half, and we can essentially fit almost, you know, twice as many in the same space and for the same power envelope. And that's how we got such big performance improvements in gaming and consoles, whatever. Now we're already seeing this on the PC side, right? Guys, you guys have been complaining about the prices of GPUs, right? For years now. We've seen what's been happening with Nvidia and AMD as well, right? 20 years ago, roughly, right? 2000, around the time the Xbox 360 launched, a flagship GPU was about $500. $400 to $500 for the absolute top of the line GPU of the day, right? And nowadays, a top of the line GPU is costing, you know, real world costing like $2,000. Okay, there's reasons for that. Okay, and unfortunately, that happened over 20 years. The trends have been getting worse. You know, a mid-range GPU nowadays. A mid-range that used to be something like $200. That was considered a nice, not entry level, but a nice solid mid-range GPU, $200 to maybe $300. Now that same GPU is roughly in the, you know, let's say $500 to $800 range is what's considered mid-range now, right? There are reasons for that. This stuff isn't getting any cheaper to manufacture. In fact, it's getting more expensive. And not only that, we're not seeing transistor sizes shrink anywhere near to what used to be the case. The PS5 Pro, for all intents and purposes, it seems like they're on a 6 nanometer process. Back in 2020, 4 years ago almost, when the PS5 launched, what did it launch on? It launched on a 7 nanometer part. So in 4 years, right? We're seeing the transistor size go from 7 nanometers down a whole 1 nanometer to 6. To put that in perspective, you know, why we would see prices go down so fast back in the PS2 era and even PS3 era, right? While Sony was able to get the price down, you know, so fast when it was launched, so it's such a high price. Because again, Moore's law said in roughly 18 months, the die would shrink in half. We would go from 28 nanometers to 14 nanometer, right? Or somewhere thereabouts, right? That's the kind of stuff we saw within a 2-year period. So we can drop. And even when the PS4 Pro came out and the Xbox One X came out, right? We saw die strengths that was, you know, almost, you know, in half, cut in half. And it took a little longer. It was more like, again, a 4-year period in that case. But we still saw that. Now, here we are now going into 4 years from the launch of the PS5, and the die is only shrunk 1 nanometer. So what that means is, you know, we're not going to see an ability to add a whole lot more transistors, you know, because the die size can't get but so much bigger. It's still meant to be a console. People already talked about how big the PS5 base was, right? So you got to fit things in the same amount of space. Before, you can cram double that, right, in a 4-year period, let's say. You can cram double the amount of actual transistors, right, meaning that the overall processing power throughput can be twice as much, at least, right? And then you can maybe even add more to that. We can't do that anymore, right? Sony can't do that anymore. AMD cannot do that anymore, right? This is a problem that's going to affect Microsoft and Nintendo and everybody, right? So we're hitting the physical walls of being able to shrink the size of the chip and being able to reduce the cost. And without being able to do that, what Sony was left with was basically saying, okay, so take the PS5 die. We're going to try to cram as much as we can in it. And what do they end up with? Do we get a 2x improvement? Do we get a 10x improvement like we used to see gen on gen? No, we get a 45% improvement on the GPU. You know, do we have extra thermal headroom now because we have more efficient transistors? No, we don't. We don't. We're on the same, basically the same node. So they can't even increase the clock speeds. There's also rumors that the GPU clock is actually even less, it's lowered, which is really weird. I still am very skeptical on that, but there is rumors saying that it is lower. And that would be why, though. It's just that there's a fixed amount of power, right, that they can put out that box. And every increase to the CPU or GPU is going to increase that. Now, what does that mean for pricing on this thing? Right? I'm expecting at least $599, at least $599. What does that mean for the form factor? For the size, it's going to be big like the PS5, at least as big as the PS5, if not even bigger, right? Again, they didn't shrink the nodes. This system still has everything that the PS5 had. It still has the Tempest engine. It even talked about even improving on the audio processing for the Pro. It still has the SSD drive, right? It still has all of the other, I/O, dedicated hardware for the I/O, fast I/O, and all that stuff. And guess what? We are getting a GPU that now goes from 36 CUs all the way up to 60 CUs, almost double, not quite double, but I mean, again, 70% almost larger GPU. So they did do work. They invested pretty much all of it in the GPU side. CPU, that remains the same. GPU, there's not much room of even an overclock there. So they're doing the best they can, given the fact that they're hitting these walls, right? And they're doing the best they can. So that's what it looks like. That's one of the biggest things to take away from here, right? And this is, again, we see this in the PC side. We see everything I've talked about on the channel, like all the consumer electronics, the TV business, we're seeing this. Prices can't come down because it's costing more money to make these things. It's costing more money, not less. So everyone, reduce the price. It's like how, they got to make money. They got to stay in business, right? And, frankly, we're just not seeing, it's 4 years. We're just not seeing hardware evolve that much. Not that much at all, right? So what are they doing, right? Kudos to Sony. They recognize this, right? The PS5 Pro, on paper, from what we know so far, is addressing the two biggest limitations of the PS5. The two biggest things that is missing, if you want to say that, from state of the art. The first is actually software, not hardware. It's the idea of having an intelligent machine learning upscaling solution. And right, and they're addressing that, which again, that PSSR is not limited to PS5 Pro, right? That's going to be carried over to PS6 or whatever it is later and beyond, right? So this is the long-term investment for them. But that's smart. That's software. So you don't need to have more raw hardware, more teraflops. Let me say this to make this very clear. This machine learning upscaling solution has the potential to deliver better image quality and better frame rates, way better image quality and way better frame rates than what they can achieve by just pushing an extra few teraflops in the GPU, let's say, right? Or pushing an extra few megahertz, frequency increase, which again, as I just said, is super, super hard to do from a hardware perspective right now, right? From costs, from thermals, from form factor, from size limitation, power limitations for the console. It's super, super hard to even think about doing that. So they did what they could to give it somewhat of a boost for sure, but now it's the software. This machine learning upscaling can do more for you, more wonders, I'm telling you, for performance than if it was 18 teraflops instead of 16.7. People are saying, oh, I wish it was at least 18. I wish it was 20 so it could be 2x. Guess what? This software solution has more potential to deliver that than that. Trust me. So that's a smart thing. That's something to keep in mind. And the other, big limitation, of course, is the ray tracing. So PS5, the consoles in general, I mean, compared to, again, these gargantuan, $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 GPUs that you can get on the PC side, the consoles were really anemic, right, in terms of their ray tracing performance. So there are games with ray tracing, but they're really, really subtle, hardly noticeable, and there had to be a lot of compromises to get ray tracing on the consoles to date. So being able to go in on this and deliver 2, 3, 4 times more ray tracing performance, that's huge. And that's meaningful, because I guarantee you that ray tracing will have a bigger impact on the graphics, right? Again, than any extra few teraflops or extra few megahertz of frequency can do. Trust me. Everyone wants to talk about pushing pixels and pushing frame rates. So yes, you get to 20 teraflops, and that makes you feel warm and fuzzy inside. And maybe now, yeah, they can kind of raw throughput their way to double 1440p to get to 4K, or just pushing pixels. But it's the same game. Same game, same visual makeup, just more pixels. Guys, no. That's not cutting it. And Sony knows that. That's not really meaningful, right? It's going to be way more meaningful to add ray tracing to a game that didn't have it before, let's say, than it would be to just push more pixels. Trust me. So those two, focal points for Sony are, in fact, very smart, I would say. Very, very smart. That's about it. But that's all I can say right now. I mean, how do I feel about it? Am I excited? I'm still cautiously optimistic, I'll say. I think on paper, these pieces, the combination of software, hardware, and yes, they did, they added more memory bandwidth. They apparently added more usable memory for game developers to use, like over a gig extra RAM there. All of these little things are going to help for sure. But the overall mission statement for the Pro, in terms of why it even exists, is to deliver more ray trace games, which again, that's the future. That's the future of video game graphics. And being able to do that now means that a lot more developers would be willing to invest in ray tracing, because up until this point, there's been a lot of hesitation because they don't want to just do something that they only can do on the PC. One of the first things they ask are, well, will this work on console? And if they can't get it working on console, a lot of times they're not willing to do it. So having more ray tracing performance on console side means it's an overall great story for just ray tracing in general. And that's going to be, again, a good thing to have for sure. So I'm somewhat excited, right? I am. I mean, we're still dealing with 4K. We're not dealing with a whole nother resolution bump or something like that. It's just about refinement and, just taking PS5 games and delivering. Now, what I hope, what the dream is here, guys, and this is what I've always felt is the dream for a Pro here, is to take the fidelity modes on the current PS5, but fidelity modes that usually run at 30. They're usually a high resolution 30, so native 4K 30 or 1800p or 1440p, whatever, but 30. The dream here was to take those fidelity modes with the same level of graphics and detail and now be able to get that to 60. So now you have native 4K 60 on the Pro, something that was native 4K 30 on the base. Now you have 1440p 30 on the base, now being maybe 1440p 60 on the Pro, that kind of thing. To me, that was the dream. And then the performance modes can go, which typically ran at 60. Now maybe they can push 120. Now, technically, that could still be very much feasible. The raw performance, the hardware wouldn't get you there. The numbers, the 45% rendering performance, right, would not get you there at all. The CPU is the same. So if you're CPU bound, you're still CPU bound. You're stuck. What could get you there, though, is the combination of, 50% more rendering performance, 70% more compute on the GPU, 2 to 4 times more ray tracing performance now, but with that machine learning upscaler that can get you better image quality at 4K output while increasing performance, because you're basically putting less load on the hardware to still get you to the same output. That's what the machine learning upscaling is about. That could get you there. It remains to be seen, though, right? We got to see what this thing looks like. We got to really learn more about the PSSR stuff. I am still optimistic. We'll wait for the real details, but that's what I would like to see. I think that would be the ultimate compelling story, especially for the real enthusiast crowd and the PC crowd that, they refuse to play games on PlayStation because they feel like it's just such a stark quality difference. if you're doing stuff like that where you really can say, okay, your games are 4K 120 in some cases, or 4K 60 legitimately. There's been rumors that, you know, Sony's planning to market a system as 4K 120. If you really can get there, even if it's, you know, reconstructed or upscaled, but it's convincing. If you can say that and do that, and most games are really running at 4K 60 and stuff like that, that's compelling. I think that will be something that can maybe give even the PC crowd at least a reason to pause. Still not going to be the top of the line, of course, 4090, 4080 stuff. But it will be, I think, enough for a console, for your TV running at 60 to 120, I think, to be pretty compelling. But I don't know that will happen, right? Based on the bump that we're seeing. But, you know, this raised a lot of questions on what we might see or not see for PS6 and Xbox Next. They're running, it's going to be the same situation. You know, you wonder why the Switch 2 has not materialized yet. This can also, you know, play a part into that. We're really in a very different place than we were 10, 20 years ago. And that's why everyone said, oh, the jump is getting so small, generational jumps. This is why. And this, you know, this is what we're going to see. We got to rely more on software and more on innovation than just pure hardware increases. We're just not going to see it unless, you know, again, you can do it. You can cram more transistors. You can get 20 teraflops in that machine. What that will look like is this huge box, this huge monolithic box, right? That's bigger than the current systems. That's way more expensive than the current system. Today's when a console will now be $800, $900, $1,000 and be these look like PC towers. That's what that will look like. Then yeah, you can get your performance, you know, increases that you're used to in that regard, right? So we probably won't. We obviously don't want a console to do that. Before a console does do that, PC would just completely rule the day, you know, because that's essentially what would happen with that. So it's a really tough thing for Sony and Microsoft, you know, to balance. They seem to be doing pretty well, making smart decisions with what they have. So just keep that in mind. But still a lot to learn here, a lot to see in the flesh and really just see what this thing can do. But again, the promise of machine learning, upscaling, and a lot more ray tracing performance, to me, is probably the two biggest things they could have done to really have the biggest impact on the games being better than on the base PS5. It's still a PS5. Remember, this is a refresh. This isn't meant to be a full generational thing. But take your PS5 games and supercharge them. You can't do that with raw hardware anymore. That's the smart way to do it. And what you can do with hardware, they invested smartly. Obviously on the GPU side and on the ray tracing performance side. Makes sense. So that's all for me now. Let me know what you think. If you want me to talk more about this stuff, let me know that as well. PS5 Pro, convinced? Day one? Day none? Let me know. True Techno Gamer signing off from GDC. I'll talk to you guys later. Thanks.